In September 2023, the town of Ocean Springs, Mississippi, was shaken by a devastating loss. 13-year-old Aubreigh Wyatt was gone. A young life, full of promise and light, extinguished far too soon. Her death sent shockwaves through the community. A deep sadness mixed with confusion and unanswered questions. Aubreigh was known for her kindness, her warmth, and the quiet strength that made people feel safe around her. She was the kind of person who could lift others up without even trying. But behind that warmth was a pain few people truly understood. And when Aubreigh died, the circumstances surrounding her death left her family searching for answers. Heather Wyatt, Aubreigh's mother, wasn't prepared for the silence that followed. The explanations didn't add up. The details didn't make sense. And the more Heather pressed for answers, the more resistance she faced. Losing her daughter was a nightmare, but not knowing why was unbearable. Heather knew her daughter, and she knew something wasn't right. What happened in the days leading up to Aubreigh's death? What was she dealing with that no one saw? And why did it feel like the truth was being hidden? Heather was determined to find out. Her grief quickly became a mission, to uncover the truth and make sure that no other parent would have to experience the same pain. But that search for truth came with obstacles. The people who should have supported her seemed hesitant to speak. Questions about bullying, mental health, and accountability started to rise. Not just academically, but emotionally. She had a way of understanding people that went beyond her years. Aubreigh's family was close. Heather Wyatt, her mom, was more than just a parent. She was Aubreigh's biggest supporter and her closest confidant. Heather always described Aubreigh as wise beyond her years, the kind of daughter who didn't just listen, but truly understood. Aubreigh's ability to comfort others was remarkable for someone her age. When Heather was stressed or overwhelmed, Aubreigh would notice and sit with her. Not always saying much, but making her presence known. That was just who she was. A steady presence, a quiet strength. But Aubreigh wasn't just emotionally gifted. She was talented in so many ways. She loved sports and had a competitive side that came out on the field. She played soccer with a kind of quiet determination, pushing herself not to win attention, but because she wanted to be her best. Her coaches would often comment on her discipline and her ability to stay calm under pressure. Off the field, Aubreigh was equally impressive. She had a creative side. She loved art and music, and she could spend hours sketching or listening to her favorite songs. Her friends adored her. Aubreigh was the one they turned to when they needed advice or just someone to sit with them in silence. She had a way of making people feel safe. Even at school, teachers noticed how other students were drawn to her. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but her presence carried weight. Aubreigh was the kind of person you wanted in your corner, loyal, thoughtful, and unshakable. Heather and Aubreigh shared a bond that was rare. Heather would often say that Aubreigh seemed to know what she needed even before she said it. They had their routines, movie nights, late-night conversations, little traditions that made their relationship feel more like a friendship than just a mother and daughter. Heather would later say that Aubreigh was the person who kept her grounded, the person who reminded her what really mattered. But underneath the surface, there were signs that Aubreigh was struggling. Heather noticed it in small ways at first. Aubreigh would come home from school quieter than usual. Her smile, once so easy, started to fade. There were nights when Aubreigh wouldn't say much at all, retreating into herself. Heather would ask her if everything was okay, and Aubreigh would always say yes. But Heather knew her daughter, and she knew that something was shifting. In the months leading up to her death, Aubreigh's personality started to change in ways that were hard to explain. She became more withdrawn, more guarded. She stopped talking about school as much. The light that had always been so present in her seemed to dim. Heather worried but tried to give Aubreigh space. After all, she was growing up. Maybe this was just part of that process. But it wasn't just Heather who noticed. Aubreigh's friends started to say that she wasn't herself. She was more anxious, more distant. She stopped laughing as much. When her friends asked her what was wrong, Aubreigh would brush it off. But the change was there, unmistakable and growing. Heather began to worry that something was happening at school. She asked Aubreigh about her classmates, about her teachers, but Aubreigh would always say everything was fine. Still, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was carrying something heavy. And the hardest part was that Aubreigh wouldn't or couldn't tell her what it was. Despite everything, Aubreigh pushed through. She kept going to school, kept playing soccer, and kept showing up for her friends. But the weight she was carrying was becoming harder to hide. Heather would later say that she felt helpless, like she was watching her daughter slip away and didn't know how to stop it. Aubreigh's last days were filled with the usual routines: school, soccer, time with friends. But looking back, Heather would see the signs more clearly. The way Aubreigh's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way her laughter felt a little forced. The way she would sit in silence for just a moment too long. At the time, it felt like normal teenage mood swings. But after what happened, those small moments would take on a different weight. Aubreigh Wyatt was more than just a bright student, a talented athlete, and a loyal friend. She was the kind of person who made people feel safe, who could sense when someone needed comfort before they even said a word. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Her life should have been long and full, but for reasons that would soon become painfully clear, it wasn't. Heather Wyatt would later say that Aubreigh had a quiet strength that most people never saw. But even the strongest people have limits. And when Aubreigh reached hers, the world lost someone truly irreplaceable. It started when Aubreigh was in the 5th grade. She had always been a bright, kind-hearted child, but as she entered middle school, the atmosphere around her began to shift. The first signs were subtle: a whisper behind her back, a group of girls exchanging looks and laughing as she walked by. But soon it escalated. The teasing turned into direct insults. The laughter became louder and harder to ignore. Aubreigh's mother, Heather, began to notice small changes at home. Aubreigh would come home quieter than usual, sometimes heading straight to her room without saying much. When Heather would ask if everything was okay, Aubreigh would shrug it off with a soft smile, insisting that nothing was wrong. But the cracks were starting to show. By the time Aubreigh was in middle school, the bullying had become relentless. It wasn't just teasing anymore, it was targeted and cruel. Classmates would send her messages on social media, mocking her appearance and questioning her worth. Heather later discovered that some of the messages were filled with hate and malice, urging Aubreigh to harm herself. These weren't random incidents. It was calculated, intentional cruelty. At school, Aubreigh faced it from all sides. In the hallways, kids would bump into her or pretend not to see her. In class, notes were passed with insults scribbled across them. When she logged onto social media, the attacks followed her home. It seemed like there was no escape. Heather began to see the toll it was taking on her daughter. Aubreigh, once so full of life and laughter, started withdrawing. She stopped wanting to hang out with friends. Her smile became less frequent. She lost interest in things she once loved: sports, music, even spending time with her family. The light in her eyes began to dim. Heather reached out to the school for help, but the response was frustratingly slow. Teachers promised they would look into it. Meetings were held, but nothing seemed to change. The bullying continued, and Aubreigh grew more isolated. Heather even monitored Aubreigh's social media, deleting hateful messages before Aubreigh could see them. But the damage was already being done. Aubreigh confided in her mother about some of the bullying, but Heather suspected she was holding back the worst of it. She later learned that Aubreigh had been covering up the full extent of the abuse, shielding her mother from the ugliest parts of her reality. Aubreigh didn't want to worry Heather, but inside, she was struggling. Then came the night when Heather overheard Aubreigh crying in her room. It was the kind of deep, painful sobbing that no child should ever have to experience. Heather sat beside her, holding her daughter, reassuring her that everything would be okay. But Aubreigh's tears told a different story. Heather began to realize just how serious this had become, and how little protection Aubreigh was getting from the outside world. Heather later found out that Aubreigh had been the target of a group chat, a private messaging thread where classmates had ganged up on her. Some messages were beyond cruel, encouraging Aubreigh to harm herself. Heather's heart broke when she saw the messages, and her anger grew when she realized that no one at the school had taken meaningful action to stop it. Despite everything, Aubreigh tried to push through. She continued going to school, doing her best to act normal. But behind her smile, the weight of the bullying was becoming too much to carry. Heather watched as her daughter fought to stay strong. But the cracks were widening, and Heather feared that soon, they would become too deep to repair. The bullying had gone on for years, starting in 5th grade and following Aubreigh into middle school. Heather later described those years as a slow unraveling, watching her daughter face cruelty that no child should ever have to endure. Heather felt helpless, trapped between wanting to protect Aubreigh and not knowing how to make it stop. She hoped that Aubreigh's strength would carry her through. But the truth was, the damage was already done. September 4th, 2023, started like any other day. Heather Wyatt remembers it clearly, the details etched into her memory like a scar that refuses to fade. Aubreigh had seemed quiet that morning, but Heather didn't think much of it. Aubreigh had been struggling for a while, and quiet days had become more common. Still, there was nothing to suggest that this day would be any different from the others. Heather remembers hearing the soft sound of Aubreigh's footsteps coming down the stairs. Aubreigh sat at the kitchen table, barely touching her breakfast. Heather asked if she was feeling okay. Aubreigh nodded, offering a weak smile. Heather knew that smile. It was the same smile Aubreigh had been using for months, the one that tried to hide the sadness underneath. Heather thought about pressing her daughter for more, but she didn't want to push. Aubreigh had always been private, careful not to worry her mother more than she already had. That morning, Heather gave Aubreigh a hug before she left for school. It wasn't a particularly long hug, but looking back, Heather wishes she had held on a little longer. As Aubreigh walked toward the door, Heather called out, "I love you." Aubreigh turned, smiled faintly, and said, "I love you too." Those would be the last words they would exchange. Heather had no way of knowing what was about to happen. The details of the hours that followed remain painfully unclear. Aubreigh went to school that morning. Some classmates later said she had seemed quiet, more withdrawn than usual. Others claimed they saw her checking her phone repeatedly, her expression growing darker with each glance. At some point that day, something changed. Heather would later find out that Aubreigh had received a series of cruel messages. The same cycle of bullying that had haunted her for years had escalated yet again. Messages telling her that she was worthless, that she would never be good enough, that no one would care if she were gone. Heather would later discover that Aubreigh had left school early. There are gaps in the timeline, missing minutes that no one has been able to account for. What's known is that Aubreigh went home. Heather wasn't there. She had been running errands. When she returned later that afternoon, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Heather called out for Aubreigh. No answer. She assumed Aubreigh was in her room. Maybe she was resting. Heather set down the groceries and went to check on her daughter. She knocked on Aubreigh's bedroom door. Still no answer. A sudden chill ran through her as she pushed the door open. What she saw next would shatter her world. Aubreigh was gone. Heather's screams filled the house as the reality of what had happened set in. She immediately called for help, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely dial the number. When the paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Aubreigh had taken her own life. The news hit the Wyatt family like a tidal wave. Heather collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She kept repeating her daughter's name, as if saying it over and over could somehow undo what had happened. But it couldn't. Aubreigh was gone. Heather's devastation spilled into the hours that followed. Family members and friends arrived at the house, their faces stricken with disbelief. No one could comprehend it. Aubreigh had always been such a bright light. How could it have ended like this? Heather sat in the living room, clutching one of Aubreigh's stuffed animals. Her hands were trembling. She couldn't stop thinking about the messages, the ones Aubreigh had received that morning, the final blows that had pushed her over the edge. Heather would later learn that some of the classmates who had bullied Aubreigh had been messaging her even in the final hours of her life. The cruelty didn't stop until it was too late. The community's reaction was immediate. Word spread quickly through Ocean Springs. Aubreigh Wyatt, the bright, talented 13-year-old with the kind heart, was gone. The school held an emergency assembly. Grief counselors were called in. Classmates sat in stunned silence, some crying openly. Others struggled to understand how this could have happened. Heather's devastation turned to quiet anger. She had tried to protect her daughter. She had reached out to the school. She had confronted some of the bullying directly, but it hadn't been enough. The system that was supposed to protect Aubreigh had failed her. The messages Aubreigh received were evidence of that failure, and Heather knew that Aubreigh's story couldn't end here. The days that followed were a blur of condolences and funeral arrangements. Heather stood at the front of the church, looking down at her daughter's casket. It was covered with white flowers, Aubreigh's favorite. Heather's hands shook as she placed a framed photo of Aubreigh on the table beside it. The picture showed Aubreigh smiling, her eyes bright with happiness. Heather couldn't reconcile that image with the reality of what had happened. As Heather stood by the casket, person after person approached her. Classmates, teachers, neighbors. Some apologized, saying they wished they had known how much Aubreigh was struggling. Others admitted they had seen the bullying but didn't know how to intervene. Heather nodded, but inside, her heart ached. Too little, too late. After the funeral, Heather sat alone in Aubreigh's bedroom. Her daughter's belongings were still scattered across the room. Schoolbooks, notes, a pair of headphones resting on the desk. Heather picked up Aubreigh's phone, her hands trembling. She opened the last messages Aubreigh had received. The cruelty was staggering. Heather's heart broke all over again. It was in that moment that Heather made a decision. Aubreigh's story couldn't end like this. The bullying, the cruelty, the failure to protect her. It couldn't be ignored. Heather knew she had to tell Aubreigh's story. The world needed to know what had happened. Aubreigh's death couldn't be just another tragic loss. It had to mean something. In the days after Aubreigh's death, the Ocean Springs Police Department opened an investigation. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Aubreigh had died by suicide. But for Heather and the people of Ocean Springs, that conclusion was only the beginning of a deeper search for answers. Had the relentless bullying Aubreigh endured played a role in her death? Could something have been done to prevent this tragedy? These were the painful questions that began to surface. Questions that Heather couldn't let go unanswered. For Heather, silence was never an option. Faced with unimaginable grief, she made a decision that would define the next chapter of her life. She turned to social media, specifically TikTok, determined to make sure her daughter's story was heard. Heather started posting videos that shared Aubreigh's struggles, the bullying she had endured, and the emotional toll it had taken. The response was immediate. Her raw, emotional honesty resonated with thousands of viewers, many of whom had experienced similar pain or knew someone who had. Support for Heather's fight grew rapidly. The hashtag Justice for Aubreigh started trending as more people learned about Aubreigh's story and the circumstances leading up to her death. Messages of support poured in from around the country. Heather's videos were emotional and direct. A grieving mother sharing her pain and calling for accountability. People were moved not only by the tragic nature of Aubreigh's death, but also by Heather's strength and vulnerability in the face of such a profound loss. In one video, Heather spoke about the day she lost Aubreigh, about how she never imagined that her vibrant, loving daughter would reach such a dark place. She described the helplessness of knowing that Aubreigh had suffered in silence for so long, and the guilt that came with wondering if more could have been done. Her words were gut-wrenching, but they struck a chord with parents and young people alike, sparking a conversation about the impact of bullying and mental health struggles. The hashtag Justice for Aubreigh movement became more than just a call for answers. It became a symbol of solidarity against bullying. People who had never met Aubreigh felt connected to her story. Schools and communities began organizing discussions about bullying and mental health. Heather's bravery in speaking out helped break the silence around these issues, giving others the courage to confront their own struggles. The emotional toll on Heather was enormous. Recounting the darkest moments of her life in front of the world was painful, but she knew it was necessary. Aubreigh's story had to be told. Heather was determined that her daughter's death would not be in vain. Through her grief, she found a sense of purpose, to make sure no other family would have to experience the same devastating loss. Heather's message was clear. Bullying destroys lives, and it's time to take it seriously. Her TikTok platform became a place not only to remember Aubreigh but to push for real change. Schools needed to be held accountable. Bullying policies needed to be strengthened. Mental health support for students needed to improve. Heather's fight was no longer just about Aubreigh. It was about protecting every child who might feel isolated, hopeless, or scared. Heather's strength in the face of tragedy inspired countless people. Through her pain, she found a way to turn her daughter's memory into a force for good. The support from the public gave her strength, but the loss of Aubreigh remained a permanent wound. Heather's fight for justice was far from over, but she had already created a powerful legacy for her daughter. Aubreigh's story had become a catalyst for change, and Heather was determined to see it through. Heather Wyatt's campaign to tell Aubreigh's story was gaining momentum. Her emotional videos on TikTok had reached thousands of people, sparking conversations about bullying and mental health across the country. Supporters rallied behind her, drawn not only to the tragedy of Aubreigh's death, but to Heather's strength in speaking out despite her grief. But as Heather's message spread, not everyone was comfortable with the attention it was drawing. In early 2024, Heather was hit with a legal blow that threatened to silence her. A Mississippi judge issued an order restricting Heather's ability to post about Aubreigh's death on social media. The details of the ruling were not entirely clear to the public, but the effect was immediate. Heather was no longer allowed to share videos about Aubreigh or the bullying she had endured. For someone who had poured her heart into telling her daughter's story, into fighting for answers, it felt like a direct attack on her ability to seek justice. Heather's response was one of raw frustration and disbelief. After everything she had been through, losing her daughter, grappling with unanswered questions, and finding strength through the support of strangers, this legal order felt like an attempt to erase Aubreigh's story. In a tearful statement, Heather described how talking about Aubreigh had given her a sense of purpose. Now that outlet was being taken away. The public reaction was swift and intense. Supporters of Heather and the hashtag Justice for Aubreigh movement flooded social media with outrage. How could a grieving mother be silenced for speaking about her child's death? Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and chanting in support of Heather. Online, the hashtag Justice for Aubreigh surged once again, with thousands of posts calling for the ban to be overturned. Legal experts and free speech advocates quickly joined the conversation. Some argued that Heather's right to speak about her daughter's death was protected under the First Amendment. Others questioned the motivations behind the order. Why would the court seek to silence a grieving mother unless there was something uncomfortable about the story she was telling? The pressure on the legal system intensified as Heather's story gained more media attention. Behind closed doors, Heather was battling feelings of helplessness and anger. For months, she had channeled her grief into action, determined to make sure Aubreigh's death wouldn't be forgotten. Now, the court was threatening to strip her of that power. But Heather wasn't about to give up. She had already endured the unthinkable, and she wasn't going to stop fighting now. After weeks of mounting public pressure and legal challenges, the court reversed its decision. The social media ban was lifted. Heather was free to speak about Aubreigh once again. In an emotional video posted shortly after the ruling, Heather thanked her supporters and vowed to continue telling her daughter's story. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her determination was unwavering. "They tried to silence me," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere." The lifting of the ban was a victory, but Heather knew the fight was far from over. The support from the public had given her strength, but the questions surrounding Aubreigh's death remained unanswered. Heather promised to keep pushing for accountability, for Aubreigh and for every child who had suffered in silence. Heather's victory in court was not just a personal win. It was a powerful statement about the importance of speaking out against bullying and injustice. Her fight had become larger than just Aubreigh's story. It was a call for change, and Heather was determined to see that change through. As Heather Wyatt's story spread, so did the questions. What had really happened to Aubreigh Wyatt? Why had her bullying gone unaddressed for so long? Why had it taken her death for people to start paying attention? The official reports had ruled her death a suicide, but for many people following Heather's story, that answer wasn't enough. It didn't sit right. And soon, speculation began to fill the gaps left by the unanswered questions. Online forums, social media platforms, and even local conversations became hotbeds of rumors and theories. Some believed that Aubreigh's bullying had been far more severe than what was publicly known, that it involved more than just harsh words and online harassment. There were whispers that Aubreigh had been physically threatened, that certain students had gone beyond bullying into dangerous territory. And then there were the questions about the authorities. Rumors spread that the school and local police were protecting certain students. The suggestion was that some of the kids involved in Aubreigh's bullying came from influential families with connections to the school board and local officials. The idea that Aubreigh's case was being deliberately downplayed to protect certain individuals took hold online, fueling heated debates. Posts on TikTok and Twitter dissected every detail of Aubreigh's story: her last interactions, the timeline of the bullying, and the response from the school and authorities. Why had certain details been left out of the official reports? Why had some bullying incidents been brushed aside by the school? The speculation didn't stop there. Some questioned whether Aubreigh had even taken her own life at all. The circumstances of her death, the lack of immediate intervention by the school, the history of bullying, and the alleged mishandling of complaints led some to believe that there was more to the story than what was being presented. Others pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline of events, unanswered questions about what Aubreigh said or did in the hours leading up to her death. Was there something being covered up? Through it all, Heather remained determined to keep the focus on the facts. She addressed the growing speculation in several emotional TikTok videos, thanking her supporters but urging them to stay focused on what could be proven. Heather never dismissed the possibility that there was more to Aubreigh's death than what the authorities had acknowledged, but she was careful not to let rumors overshadow the core of her fight, holding those responsible for the bullying accountable and ensuring that no other child would suffer the same fate. Heather's measured response didn't stop the speculation, but it reinforced the seriousness of her campaign. She wasn't chasing headlines or trying to feed into online hysteria. She was fighting for truth and justice. Still, the pressure on the school and local authorities intensified. Journalists began asking tougher questions. Protesters demanded more transparency from the school board. Parents who had once brushed off the bullying complaints were now confronting the uncomfortable reality that their own children might have been part of the problem, or that the school had knowingly ignored warning signs. Public frustration grew. School officials held press conferences, assuring the community that they were conducting internal reviews. But to many, these statements felt hollow. Why had it taken Aubreigh's death for these reviews to begin? Why had Heather been forced to go public to get anyone to listen? The authorities' lack of urgency only fed the growing belief that there was something they didn't want the public to know. Despite the swirling rumors, Heather's focus remained steady. She continued to share Aubreigh's story, sticking to the facts but refusing to back down from uncomfortable truths. She wasn't interested in conspiracy theories. She was interested in accountability. And she knew that the more pressure the public put on the school and the authorities, the harder it would be for them to keep ignoring the questions that mattered most. For Heather, this wasn't about fueling speculation. It was about exposing the truth. And as the rumors and theories spread, one thing became increasingly clear. The full story of what had happened to Aubreigh Wyatt had yet to be told. Aubreigh Wyatt's death left an emptiness in her family and her community. But out of that loss emerged a movement. Heather Wyatt, faced with the unbearable pain of losing her daughter, refused to let Aubreigh's story fade into the background. For Heather, silence wasn't an option. She knew that if Aubreigh's story could prevent even one other child from experiencing the same torment, she had to keep speaking out. And so, in the months following Aubreigh's death, Heather took her fight to the public, determined to transform her grief into action. Heather's TikTok account, which had initially served as a space for personal reflection and remembrance, evolved into a platform for advocacy. She shared Aubreigh's story with heartbreaking honesty, speaking directly to parents, children, and anyone willing to listen. Her posts weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw, emotional, and deeply personal. She spoke about the bullying, the mental toll it had taken on Aubreigh, and the failures of the school to intervene when it mattered most. Her message resonated. Videos of Heather recounting Aubreigh's struggle quickly gained traction, drawing thousands of comments and millions of views. Heather's vulnerability struck a nerve. Parents from across the country began sharing their own stories of bullying. The warning signs they'd missed, the battles they'd fought with school officials, the pain of watching their children suffer in silence. Heather became a voice for those parents, channeling her personal loss into a broader call for accountability. It wasn't enough to raise awareness. Heather wanted change. She began advocating for stronger anti-bullying policies at the state and national level, meeting with local officials and participating in public forums to push for legislation that would hold schools more accountable for handling bullying complaints. The response from the community was powerful. Candlelight vigils were held in Aubreigh's memory, where classmates, teachers, and neighbors gathered to honor her life. Messages of support flooded social media. Strangers from across the country left heartfelt comments under Heather's videos, expressing their sympathy and admiration for her courage. Local businesses donated resources to support anti-bullying initiatives. Aubreigh School held a memorial event where classmates shared stories about her kindness and resilience. But it wasn't just local support. Heather's message reached a national audience. News outlets began covering her story, framing it as a tragic but urgent reminder of the dangers of unchecked bullying. Influencers and celebrities amplified Heather's message, helping to grow the #JusticeForAubrey movement into a nationwide call to action. Heather became a sought-after speaker at anti-bullying events and school safety conferences, using Aubreigh's story to highlight the gaps in the current system and the need for stronger protections for vulnerable students. Despite the growing attention, Heather remained focused on the personal side of her fight. She wasn't seeking fame, she was seeking accountability. She wanted schools to take bullying more seriously. She wanted parents to feel empowered to intervene. And most of all, she wanted kids like Aubreigh to feel safe, to know that they weren't alone. In one emotional TikTok video, Heather addressed Aubreigh directly. Fighting back tears, she promised her daughter that her death would not be in vain, that her story would save lives. Heather also used her platform to speak directly to parents and children. She urged parents to pay closer attention to their kids' emotional health, to look beyond the surface and listen when something seemed wrong. To children, she offered a message of hope and validation, that their pain was real, that they mattered, and that asking for help wasn't a weakness but a sign of strength. Heather's videos became a source of comfort for many young people who were struggling, and her inbox quickly filled with messages from kids thanking her for making them feel seen and heard. Aubreigh's story became more than a tragedy. It became a catalyst for change. Schools in the Ocean Springs district began reviewing their bullying policies, implementing new protocols for reporting and addressing harassment. Other districts followed suit, recognizing the urgent need to create safer environments for students. Heather's persistence and openness made it impossible for schools to ignore the issue any longer. For Heather, the fight was never just about seeking justice for Aubreigh. It was about making sure no other family would have to endure the same loss. Aubreigh's legacy wasn't just one of heartbreak. It was one of strength, resilience, and the power of a mother's love. Heather had turned her grief into a mission, and as long as there were children who needed protection, she wasn't going to stop fighting. Aubreigh Wyatt's story is not just a tragedy. It's a call for change. A young girl, full of life and potential, was taken too soon. Her mother, Heather, has shown unimaginable strength in the face of overwhelming loss. But the fight isn't over. The questions remain. The pain remains. And Heather's message, that bullying cannot be ignored, that accountability matters, continues to echo across communities. Aubreigh's story has touched countless lives. Through Heather's determination to speak out, people have come together to grieve, to support, and to demand better. This isn't just about Aubreigh anymore. It's about every child who feels alone, every parent who feels powerless, and every school that has a responsibility to protect its students. Thank you for watching. If you found Aubreigh's story meaningful, please like, comment, and subscribe. Every interaction helps to keep Aubreigh's story alive and brings attention to the fight against bullying.